Right, we're good. We'll now call to order the regular meeting of the West Sacramento Port Commission meeting, and all commissioners being present. The commission did meet in closed session.
Yes, Mr. Chair, the commission met in closed session to confer with its real property negotiator concerning the property listed in the agenda. No action was taken.
Very good. All right, thank you. All right, so join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, be led by Commissioner Sandin.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, I have no slips to speak under item that requires presentations by public on the matters that are not on the agenda. So we'll skip item 1 and go to item 2, which is consent agenda. We have 2 items to consider this evening.
I'll move the recommended action.
Motion and a...
The consent agenda, sorry. I'll move consent agenda.
All right, we have a motion.
Second.
And a second. Teresa, you got that? Yep. Commissioner Walden? All right, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. Regular agenda item number 4 is consideration of port budget for fiscal year 17-18. Mr. Laurel.
Good evening, Chair Villegas and Commissioners. So it's that time of the year where we typically do the budget. It's been about a year. We did it last time in May as well, so we're a little early, but we figured to get it done now and be ready for the coming fiscal year. We also timed it with the next item on the agenda, the work plan. The two kind of go hand in hand in terms of our agenda for the coming year, or the coming fiscal year. So let's get right into it. I wanted to first recap on 2016-17. So it was the fourth of 5 years with the first term of the SSA lease. We'll get into that in a minute. But it also coincides with the 4th consecutive year that the port has made money, and not just on operating where we look at initial revenue and expenses, but also after one time and debt service and everything, the port remains to do well under the new model. So the other factor, though, that's been interesting this year is there was a marked increase in cargo from previous years. A lot of the tonnage increase has to do with the fact that cement is back. But we noticed today, Rick did the ship logs and compared it to past years, we're at about a 13-year high compared to the last time tonnage was this high. So it appears our tenant, SSA, our main tenant, is doing well under the lease agreement, and the numbers that we're getting on cargo would suggest the same. So this is a very similar presentation to what you've seen at least the last couple of years. So the format is similar, kind of tracks with the information in the report. So just very briefly, as I mentioned, we had a good profit this year, almost $600,000. This is just based on pure operating expenses, so all the revenue from real estate and other sources minus our main operating expenses, personnel, insurance, and so forth, and also debt service is in this number as well. In revenue, real estate continues to be our dominant source of income. That includes the SSA lease, and in terms of what we did with the last budget projection versus where we're going to finish the year, we actually came in at about $150,000 over, and that is really thanks to a couple of new leases. The 4300 West Capitol property has lease revenue that was unanticipated, as well as I think the Site C improvements resulted in some additional lease revenue. And then the other factor here is rail. I think we projected a lower number for rail from the lease for the canal yard and received more revenue than we expected. The same goes for cargo. We did a very conservative estimate this year for cargo revenue just based on the uncertainty. If you recall, a year ago we had a drought and that affected rice mainly, and we had a low year on rice. But like I said, cement came back, and I think rice is fairly stabilized since then. And we actually think this number is low, just given the ship volume recently. So Rick could probably throw out a better projection, but at least for the budget projection, we're looking at about $130,000 in terms of cargo revenue. And remember, that's our share of the cargo revenue above $2 million. The first $2 million goes to the SSA. Everything above that, we get 25% of that under the current lease arrangement. And then the other sources have been very stable. Foreign trade zone revenue hasn't changed from year to year. And then on the expenses side, we did fairly well in terms of our budget projection, where we think we're going to end. And a lot of that had to do with, we got numbers right on insurance, we got our insurance numbers down, but we also had some increased costs that were not exactly accounted for, and that mainly had to do with after we acquired the Stonelaw property. We incurred a lot of maintenance costs in terms of the limbing the trees and taking care of the, really the first set of open space maintenance that we needed to do. From here on, we think it's going to be more manageable, but we are budgeting more, as you'll see in a minute, for that purpose. Debt service, the main news to report here is this was the last year of the Taylor Village debt. So that was the last source of private debt that the port owed. So now we're strictly down to the iBank and the city loans that we're paying off over the next, we have another 20 years or so on both of those. So this sums it all up, starting with that operating profit of about 591. We had one-time revenue. The sources are listed there, but the main two actually were the Arco gas station that went in at Taylor Village. We get the development impact fees from projects there, so we got about, I think, $30,000 from that project. Also, the $50,000 E&A payment from the Stonelock Phase 1 project is in this number. And then in terms of one-time expenses, we applied and received another grant for Lake Washington cleanup. Of course, the sightseeing improvements, and also the main expense here is the rail relocation study that we're engaged with the city. The port contributed about half the cost of that, $130,000. So that gives us a net profit of just over $460,000, carry over the balance from last year, and we're going to finish the year just under $2 million in terms of a cash balance in the port budget. So going forward, in terms of the 17-18 budget that we're proposing tonight, we are seeing similar revenue projections and similar expense projections as the year we're about to finish, and therefore we're also looking at a similar profit projection. So we always hope that number is going to be higher, and the main factors for that are, again, real estate and cargo. We don't foresee a huge increase in real estate revenue, but we do have some opportunity at 4300 West Capitol, where we are phasing out some tenants, like the pallet yard is hopefully going to be moving on, and we will be able to backfill that site. And then on the cargo side, as you heard, tonnage is way up from a year before, and if we see that trend continue, we should expect a much higher number on cargo. But again, as we have always done on the cargo side, we like to stay conservative. It's out of our control completely, but we do think 30,000 is a comfortable number to carry for the budget. On expenses, like I said, it's very similar to last year. The main increase, there is a slight increase in operating projection, and that's mainly to do with budgeting more funding towards maintenance. And that's not just open space maintenance at Stonelock and Seaway, but also at the North Terminal. We feel the need to do a little more maintenance improvements and really basic things. Like this year, we replaced some of the fendering, but there could be other things that come up, and it seems like it's time to budget a little more for that now that we can absorb that in our budget. And also 4300 West Capitol, we've owned that property for a little while now. It doesn't have the best grading, and other basic improvements could be needed there, so we wanted to make sure we put in some money for that as well as a maintenance measure. And then on debt service, like I said, we're down to just those remaining two. The city loan now amortizes year to year, fully amortizes. So before we were just paying interest only, now we're kicking up to principal for the next 20 years. And so the projection for this year, if you follow the same numbers down, we expect to net about $375,000. We're in the middle of doing the Stonelock levy setback analysis, and you previously authorized $200,000 for that. So net of that, we expect to clear $2 million by the end of the year in terms of the cash balance. So kind of a continuation of this year's trend. And then you've seen this before. This is our long-term model that we like to look ahead 5 years and assume that none of the leases that are under contract now are going to be extended. The only assumption here that's made is the SSA lease will continue, and we are working on that. We do think there's a good chance that SSA will be interested in an extension. So based on that, the main lines we want to look at are first on real estate revenue. Like I said, you'll notice a big change and a downward trend there, but that's only because leases expire. We do expect to either continue some of those leases or backfill them with other tenants to hopefully keep that number more stable. But even with that, you can see we still project an operating profit going forward. And we have a year-end balance that actually tracks quite nicely with the the commitment we now have to acquire the Shell property to pay $3 million at a little later than this, but it's good to see that our trend is getting to a point where even if we don't have a developer for that property or some other way to pay for it, we would have the cash available at that time. The last thing I wanted to close with is just sort of an update on the Port City balance sheet. There's been quite a few transactions over the years that have been for the benefit of either side. I would say mainly on the port side, it was those early loans that the city provided to float the operations. So those are still, like I said, owed to the city and now under a 20-year amortization. The other one was more recent. The Stonelock acquisition was a $2.1 million loan to the port. But then on the flip side, we did the solar project lease at the North Terminal for the city. So that had a value of about $270,000. And as of right now, we're ballparking the value of the 4300 West Capitol Avenue site, which is the future site of the courtyard for the city, at about $3.2 million. So all told, we're looking at a balance of roughly over $700,000 that if you just factor just a straight line on those values. Obviously, this is not any kind of agreement. It's more just a snapshot of what we see is our picture with the city right now. So with that, I'll take any questions. Also, Rick can chime in on any more detailed questions about cargo or other items. So.
All right, thank you for the presentation. Are there any comments or questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for the presentation. This looks a lot better than it does a number of years back, where we were sweating every time you would bring a budget like this forward. But now, in terms of, there's not really an asset or a balance sheet that's attached to this, so it's really, I mean, can't encapsulate what all the port owns and what its debts are in one statement. But is there, I can't recall, is there any deferred maintenance or assets that would require some type of reserve for deferred maintenance that, because I've been looking through the operating expenses, it doesn't look like there's, unless it's accounted for in some other category.
Yeah, I'd say the only place that's really accounted for is in our cash balance. And as part of our audit, I know we still do a deferred maintenance schedule that we are required to maintain that. But in terms of what are we doing to keep up with that deferred maintenance, it really still is kind of the reason we're building the cash balance. We know that, if something happened that would be considered a major maintenance item, in our lease with SSA, they take care of all the minor maintenance, but if anything major happens, and that's defined, but if something happens, we want to make sure we have a reserve for that. And that's why we're hesitant to do anything really too big with that cash balance.
Now, how is that reserve reflected? Is it a sub account for cash, or?
Not exactly. So the port fund is still, port funds is 516 in the city budget, and it really does have that one fund. There's the admin fund. We used to have it split out so there would be more of a capital side, but the port hasn't really been doing many capital projects, so we've sort of just kept it in that one fund. We have talked in the past about actually creating a reserve and putting aside money every year in a separate account. That's something we can revisit with the finance team. I think the main reason for that at this point would be making sure we do have enough money for that Shell transaction when that time comes, in addition to any deferred maintenance that catches up with us.
Yeah, I just think for presentation purposes, like the unfunded PERS liability, that when that hits the books, it gives you a little bit different perspective on this. And also, do we have an obligation, or could we have an obligation for dredging? And if so, is there a reserve? How would we come up with that?
So the dredging money we've been getting is strictly from the federal government. It doesn't require a match that I'm aware of. Do you want to?
There's a fee that we pay as a permit that I think it's a state fee that because of the impact of the dredging activity. So we pay and we budget for that. But
that's a $30,000 I see in the operating.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's no additional cash match for, if we get $1 million from the federal government. It's not like the typical federal grant where there's a 11% match or something like that.
Right. I mean, if we ever needed to dredge alongside our berths, we would be responsible for that. The Corps wouldn't cover that, but we don't see any shoaling occurring, so we're not budgeting, and that would be a major expense, but we don't anticipate having to do that.
All right, thank you.
And I guess, thank you, Mr. My question was along those lines because of the rainy season and the extended flooding period of the bypass. I know we were doing some getting funding for emergency dredging. So is that, you answered my question on, are we having to pay any additional for that? But it sounds like we're going to get full funding from the feds on that. But has there been any eruption on the revenue side, cargo coming in?
No, we've been fortunate to be able to continue to bring ships in with, riding the tide, and we anticipate the emergency dredging will start in June, is what we're being told. So should have a minimal impact on vessel activity.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great news. Thanks to the staff team for your work and in every aspect of this budget. You answered a question I had, because looking forward with the real estate revenue, you can tell that there's some leases that'll expire, so it sounds like, and it looks like from the work plan that's coming next to us, that that's ongoing work. The only particular question I had is, and I just may not have the background that my other colleagues have, is the insurance premium is huge. It's a large part of the budget, and so I don't know how regularly we examine that. I don't know if we could ever be self-funding, or we want to take that, or self-insurance funding, if we'd ever want to take on that liability. I completely understand it, but it just pops out at me looking at the detail.
And it has for 5 years for us, too. I have to give Rick credit. A couple years ago, we did a full analysis of the port's assets and had our insurer relook at everything. It actually resulted in a significant decrease. I think it was about $25,000-$30,000 decrease. But that's something that it's a number that is, I think it's still our, aside from personnel, our
Second
number
highest,
two.
yeah.
And it's beyond, like you said, you were starting to talk about other options. I think we've done everything we can with the current situation to manage that number, but we can at least maybe look at some other options going forward to not be complacent about it.
Okay.
And our base coverage is with YC Parmea, and that's the lion's share. Then we have really cheap excess liability coverage through CAPA, California Association of Port Authorities, so that's a bargain, but it's that YC Parmea policy that's spendy.
Yeah, but we did a full inventory, if I remember correctly, got some items out of there that shouldn't have been insured, stuff like that, but so I think we're down to the minimum that we can be at with the current situation, so.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Most of the follow-up on Mr. Johannessen's questions, I think it would be useful to, whether we have a separate account inside the city's accounting system or not, to allocate the balance, whether it's to deferred maintenance or to future capital needs or whatever. We ought to be describing that more, because it does stand out. Mm-hmm. Like, because since we have a balance that's significantly more than our annual expenses, we're carrying a fairly large reserve from that normal perspective, especially given that we don't have a lot of variability in our expenses or revenues because of SSA, and because the assumptions here are already assuming that we have hardly any cargo and no more real estate transactions. So it's already a very conservative budget, and with that, we still don't need a large reserve for that purpose. So when I saw it, I had the same reaction in some ways, or maybe the reaction that you're worried about. So I think it would be helpful to be able to describe more fully in future budgets what it is, have a year-over-year balance, but also have an allocation for deferred maintenance and for the kind of capital projects that you've been describing. I'm worried less about the real estate, the shell transaction. I mean, if we can't, we ought to be able to find the development resources in order to do that deal, given the valuation on the property that we've achieved. So I'm less worried about that, but the actual physical assets of the port are going to require those investments over time. I mean, if the numbers were to look like this, we'd be looking at not having a port. For the same reasons that we've talked about before. So, I guess my other question to you though is on the SSA piece. This is
the end of the fourth year
Right.
out of 5. And what's the provisions for renewal? Do we renew at some point in year 5, or is it renew a year in advance, or is there some way to provide a little bit more regularity and certainty around this process than just like coming up into the edge of it?
Right, so the next 5-year renewal period is sort of at their option, and if they don't choose to renew, I believe they need to give us a 6-month notice. It's in the lease. So there is that, but we are having active conversations with them. Rick's been doing a good job keeping the communication open, and they've actually made some investment in the North Terminal. They, if you were there for the Golden Bear, across where the boat was, there's the old Cal Agri office, and SSA has moved from portable trailers to that office, made some improvements to it. So all the signs are pointing to a strong interest on their part to renew. But I think our plan would be, and it's in the work plan actually, is to engage them in that first 6-month period to lock that in, so we don't have to worry about what we're going to do, going forward next year. And I think the interest is mutual, but we can definitely work on pursuing that. I also want to go back to your earlier comment, because I think there is another category of reserve need, and it's really about that scenario where if something happened where we couldn't operate the port. Not operating the port has profound impacts on our revenue side for cargo, because we also have 2 channel leases with Agrium and Cimex. So having that reserve be available just as a cash reserve for an operating reserve, because there could be a couple of lean years at least where if that situation was to happen, we'd have to make it up somehow, and that's where that balance would come in. So I think all the reasons are there to establish something, and we'll work with the finance team to do that.
Great, thanks.
All right. Are there any other questions or comments? It does require a motion to approve the... All right, we have a motion.
I'll second.
By Commissioner Malden, second by Commissioner Ledesma. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. And moving to item 5, which is consideration of the port's work plan update.
Okay, so a very brief presentation on this one. In the staff report, there's a table that outlines the work plan items by category. We really have 4 different categories: operations, real estate, capital improvements, and advocacy. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the main topics within the work plan as we see them from staff's perspective, where we plan to probably spend most of our time. So lease management takes up a lot of Rick's time, just managing the 30-plus tenants that we have, but it also is our main, not just our main source of income, our primary, almost 100% of our income. So that will remain a primary function to staff, along with cargo tracking. Real estate is where we've been spending the bulk of our time, and that includes the Shell deal that we just finished. But there is a lot of work to do on that deal as we go forward. Now we have to implement the terms of the PSA. There's a due diligence role that we'll have, and we'll need to keep both parties on task with that agreement. Similarly with Stonelock, we have a main task of defining the levy analysis or the levy setback line, not just for the Phase 1 project, but for everything else we do in Stonelock and Seaway going forward. And then on 4300 West Capitol, we will continue to work with the city on the courtyard design, but in the meantime, we're going to work on pursuing acquisition of the remaining property, the other 4 acres to the east. We talked a little bit about capital improvements, but the main ones here, the Lake Washington project will continue. We have a pending grant application in for more funding to do the 5th phase of that project. I'll show you a aerial in a second on the impact of that project. Talked about rail relocation. We're going to finish that study. We'll bring it back to the Port Commission and the City Council for further discussion and next steps on that. We are working with SSA to identify additional improvements in the North Terminal that could be done, could make sense for both parties. Anything that we plan to do, we'll obviously bring back for approval. But right now, it's kind of getting the scope together on those. And then I mentioned open space management. It's a kind of a new topic for us in terms of we now own a lot of open space that needs to be maintained, and we're going to be spending a lot of time working with the city on providing funding and also coordination on how we do that. This slide's a little dark on the right side, so it's kind of hard to see, but this is just a snapshot of where we were at on Lake Washington less than 5 years ago and where we're at today. So the big mess of barges that you see on that on the right side of that picture is essentially gone, and the 5th phase of the project will mostly finish the job. Again, just have to give kudos to Rick to really pursuing this project from day one. We heard from the Port Commission when we did the business plan that recreation, access, and improvement out there was really important. And I think this is our marquee project that we've been able to make a lot of progress on. So I think this picture tells a good story in terms of the impact out there. And then on advocacy, we are pursuing that bill that you received a presentation on at some point to clean up our appointment structure. That cleared the Assembly. I believe it's now in the Senate awaiting committee assignment. And then we talked about the emergency maintenance dredging. The advocacy effort was impressive there. It was first time I've seen where you had private sector, bipartisan, all the congressional representatives from here up north. We're together on this, and we have not gotten the full funding yet. You want to give a quick update on this?
Yeah, it's kind of mysterious with the Corps. We have 2.8 out of 4.7. They've identified the scope as 4.7 million. There's a $1.9 million piece remaining that we have to compete for. That's what they call 1% funds. They set aside 1% of all dredging contracts nationally into an insurance fund, if you will, for these types of situations. So we're still working with Matsui's office to secure the full 4.7.
Okay, so that completes the highlights of the work plan. Do you have any questions about those items or any others? We're happy to take them. Thank you.
All right, are there any comments, questions? Seeing none? No, not yet. Yes, ma'am.
I just have just a suggestion, given the conversation we just had, is just to add into the work plan, or working on adding a reserve fund under the financial management, because I know that will take a little time and analysis, just so that it's accurately reflected. That would be my only suggestion.
Okay.
It looks good.
It's hard to believe we're talking about adding a reserve fund column to the ports. But it makes, it is hard to believe. But thank you, Mr. Port CEO, for putting us in the position to have that conversation with all the work that you've been doing. I know this was something that you got a great team, but I think you jumped on it early and often, and here we are. So, yeah, good stuff. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so the advocacy effort on the dredging was impressive, and you noted the public-private dimension of it. We've obsessed around infrastructure, and our potential federal opportunities on infrastructure have always been about deepening for well, since the port was built, basically. So deepening. $100 million, $200 million, whatever it is, to a point where we couldn't do it at all any longer. We're in a new environment, and there is a lot of interest in infrastructure, and an infrastructure package federally that will involve public-private partnerships, as well as I know Congress is pressing even harder now on the use of the Harbor Maintenance Fund for actual port projects. If we were to get a call from the Corps or the White House or Congresswoman Matsui or Senator Feinstein or Harris tomorrow saying, hey, there's this thing moving, and there's some money available out there. What's your closest to shovel-ready, dream project for the port that isn't a $200 million deepening? And we've never been in that position before, but given, and we've certainly seen this at the city level, that always having 1 or 2 or 20 projects, as far along as we can, but at least the concepts, is a valuable strategy for us to have. And I'm curious whether you already have that in your heads, or whether starting to think it through. And I don't mean spending 6 months of staff and hiring a consultant for $250,000 to work it. I don't mean that, but just like starting to keep an eye out and think about what some opportunities for potential investment at the port might be that are closer in the range of possibility than the full-scale deepening project.
Yeah, I think we do have that in terms of a working list that we've had since we started. I think we've deferred the port entrance project for, probably a decade now, and that's still something that could have multiple benefits to the port. Maintenance dredging alone, I think that itself is a project, because we never get what we've been asking for, and eventually it's gonna be an issue. And so I think Rick would agree that that's probably something that we would advocate for more funding just for regular maintenance dredging.
They never finished the job.
Right. And then the third one would be rail. The West Side Rail project, we think, is showing signs of potential feasibility if we can line up, the funding side. And I think that's something that we would we're already pursuing the information we would need to tee up that project for the next step. So I think between those three, I'm sure there's others we could come up with, but I think it's the suggestion is well taken that we would have a sort of working list of things we would ask for if we were in that situation.
I think having at least one or two of on that list that are potential public-private partnerships, maybe the dredging with SSA could be one. I don't know, but I mean, and UP or others on the rail piece. But that's clearly the at least for the administration, key filter for what they're looking for opportunities. And so if we had a couple of those, or even if we just let other industry partners know that we're open for business in those kind of opportunities, that it might be helpful. We don't have to dream them up ourselves, but to make it clear that this is a board that's ready to engage in some public-private partnerships that will help advance our mission.
I'll plant one seed if you, while we're on the topic, and that we could use a new warehouse for rice to secure all of the rice business. The rice that bleeds down to Stockton today is largely due to a lack of ability to receive all of that in advance, particularly farmers' rice right across the street. We'd love to secure that business. So I would, and SSA would be a willing private partner in that.
And we do have a warehouse that needs replacement.
We would love to tear one down and build a new one, yes.
Right. It's within their footprint, so.
That's great. Oh, that's good stuff.
That's good thinking.
Yep, that's good stuff. All right. Any other comments or suggestions on the work plan? If not, staff's looking for approval.
I'll move the recommended action.
So we have a motion and a second by Commissioner Johannesson. All those in favor signify by saying,
With the addition,
with the addition, I'm sorry, with the change, with the column of reserves. That's perfect. Yes. All right, so.
Thank you.
You got it? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you very much. So moving on to item 6A is commission reports. Are there any commission reports?
I just would like, when the Golden Bear was in port, I know Chair Villegas, you weren't able to be there, but I received the plaque, and so I'd like to deliver it to you. There you go.
We're all going to touch it, I think.
That was a wonderful evening, and
You got your own with your name on it. It's perfect. Well, thank you. Thank you
You're
for
welcome.
representing. That was a wonderful event. And it really was actually quite wonderful in so many ways to see young kids either on the verge of graduating or actually graduating, knowing exactly what they want to do in this whole maritime world. I mean, some of these, it was amazing. I talked to probably about a dozen kids, and it was just, it was refreshing to hear them emphatically say exactly where they're going to be right after graduation. Most of them already had jobs. They knew exactly where they were going to be and what they were going to be, where they were going to be stationed and what they were going to be doing, so.
I was really glad we were able to host them.
Yeah, no, that's a great event, so. All right, well, thank you for that, and thank you for representing. Any other reports? If not, moving to Port CO report.
Nothing other than just to compliment the staff, and also, we've had the Economic Development Department. It's got Katie Yancey, Diane have kicked in on port efforts, just a superb effort, and then finance as well, as Aaron mentioned, but this is, I think, a big source of pride in terms of the focus on the port and turning it around. In addition to that, the notion of having a list of capital projects, I think we could do it pretty quickly. We are going to brush off West Side Rail Project for the meeting with UP. We'll have that one ready as a standalone, but it probably makes sense to have a range, and maybe the rice storage facility could be at a lower end, and depending on how much money becomes available, we could scale something to fit. So we'll be ready on that.
So is that something that you would bring back to the?
We could bring it back, but we have that Union Pacific meeting, sounds like it's within a month, right?
Yeah, they want to.
So we would have, West Side Rail will be a component of the regional rail plan update that group has. So that will be one that we could pull out.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right, sounds good. So any other comments? If not, we are finished with official business, looking for a motion to adjourn. A motion and a second by Commissioner Cabaldon. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.